Well, it's official. The Utah Jazz are finally in a rebuild and a complete teardown of the roster after the trades of Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell. The best part? The Jazz are just getting started. So let's talk about the Donovan Mitchell trade, the other assets they already had, and what moves the Jazz could still make. Every team in the NBA needs to have a direction in the modern NBA. You either have to be a contender, be building towards being a contender, or be rebuilding. And the Donovan Mitchell trade finally gives the Utah Jazz a direction and sends them into that full-blown rebuild. And there's no better draft class to be doing this in than in the 2023 draft class. When I initially saw the Donovan Mitchell trade, the one thing that stands out in the return is the quantity of assets in return. 3 future firsts, 2 pick swaps, alongside a 22-year-old rookie, a 23-year-old guard who scored 24 a night in his last full season, and a 25-year-old forward with good shooting at 7 feet. Could you argue that you would have preferred RJ Barrett and or preferred the reported Knicks offer from earlier in the offseason? Sure, but I think it's foolish to say that the Jazz didn't get a good return here. The picks coming from Cleveland, as good and as young as they are, will likely never be better than the 20th pick, and will likely render the pick swaps useless as well. But it is additional draft selections to add more talent later in the draft, something the Utah Jazz have done in the past, wink wink, Rudy Gobert, who was picked 27 in 2013, or they can use these selections to make a star trade of their own down the road in their resurgence back up the Western Conference. Now, one of the biggest critiques I have seen and heard of this return for Donovan Mitchell is the lack of the guy, the lack of the potential franchise cornerstone or future star, which is reasonable when you're considering trading away Donovan Mitchell. You do want a fairly significant player in return. Now, I will admit, I have never been super high on Collin Sexton. He is not some elite three-point shooter, which as a smaller guard is never ideal. And he is a shooting guard who is stuck in a point guard's body. But you can't deny that, in general, he knows how to score. I know it can feel like a while ago now, but Sexton did average over 24 points a game during the 2020-21 season, and not on bad efficiency. In fact, it was on better efficiency than Donovan Mitchell has ever had during his career. Now, I'm not saying that Sexton is a better scorer than Mitchell because I don't think he is. However, saying Sexton isn't a great scorer or that he is inefficient and simply was a shot chucker on a bad team, and that's what got him to 24 points, that's simply not true. So assuming Sexton has recovered well and will return well from injury, at still only age 23, I think Sexton is a great building block to have as a key part of your rebuild. Is he likely your number one option down the road in the rebuild? No, or at least in an ideal world he wouldn't be. But Utah are going to have many high draft picks over the next few years to acquire that number one option where Sexton can be a complementary piece. And with that being said, you are likely never going to get a future number one option in return for Donovan Mitchell because Donovan Mitchell is barely, or depending on the person you're talking to, is not a true number one option in his own right. As a 1A, 1B as he is now in Cleveland alongside Darius Garland, sure, but to be the true star in a team and the lead number one, well, I mean, Utah just traded him away because it wasn't working, so I think that gets the point across. Utah are going to have a ton of draft picks over the next few years where they can look to add that number one guy, but Sexton can be a very good complementary piece as a good scoring guard, and at the very least will offer you good value down the road. So can you want someone better than Sexton in return for Donovan Mitchell? I mean, sure, it's always fair to want more, but there are very few better options that you would realistically get in acquisition for Donovan Mitchell, and acquiring an efficient 24 point per game 23-year-old guard is not too shabby at all. Lauri Markkanen was the other proven NBA player acquired in the deal, and reports say that Utah consider him a part of their roster moving forward as he sits on another 3 years of his contract. Markkanen showed last year that he has value on a winning team. He has good length on the defensive end and most importantly is a very good spacer, which every team needs on their wing in the modern NBA. Despite initial reports saying Utah do consider him a part of their roster moving forward, I would not be surprised at all if Markkanen does eventually get traded before the end of his contract, He's a bit past the Jazz's timeline at age 25, and it is quite possible when he becomes a free agent at age 28, the Jazz will still not be super competitive, and in turn, Lauri would want to leave for elsewhere. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Lauri should get ample of opportunity over the next year or two to showcase his value, whilst the Utah Jazz should be able to capitalize on this value and net at the very least a first-round pick for him sometime in the next 2 to 3 years. The third piece of the trade is Okona Agbaji, a 2022 first-round draft pick. As we will talk about later with Utah's additional assets, the Jazz did a great job of adding 2022 first-round picks this offseason, despite making their trades after the draft. Agbaji will come in as a 22-year-old rookie and be one of the first pieces of this rebuild that is sure to be on the roster for years to come. So in general, I'd say the Jazz did pretty well in the return for Donovan Mitchell. They got future picks. They got a great young scorer. They have a valuable wing and another young guard. But again, that is just the return for Donovan Mitchell. So let's dive into the Jazz's roster and see what other young players they already have to build around. Of course, the other big move of the offseason was trading away Rudy Gobert, where again, they got a significant quantity of assets, which seems to be the prevailing theme of Utah's offseason. The assets the Jazz have received in return for Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell are as follows: Collin Sexton, Lauri Markkanen, Jared Vanderbilt, Okona Agbaji, THT, Stanley Johnson, Malik Beasley, Walker Kessler, Leandro Bomero, 7 first-round picks, and 3 first-round pick swaps. If this list doesn't show you why I've been emphasizing quantity throughout these 2 trades, then I don't know what will. Now, are some of these assets more valuable than others? Certainly. But let's discuss these assets. 7 additional first-round picks is an insane amount of opportunities over the next 6 to 7 years to acquire some great young talent, or allows you extreme flexibility with regards to acquiring talent via trades. And again, this is just 7 additional first-round picks via the Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert trade. There was also an additional first acquired via the Royce O'Neal trade. Many, if not all of these picks will be outside of the lottery, but they do still serve significant value and flexibility when you consider the sheer quantity of first-round picks. But let's move back to the players already on the roster pre-Donovan Mitchell trade. We've already discussed Collin Sexton, Lauri Markkanen, and Okona Agbaji, 2 of which are very likely to be long-term pieces of the roster, with Lauri being considered a key part of their team moving forward as well, per reports. Talen Horton-Tucker was acquired from the Lakers by flipping Patrick Beverley, who was acquired via the Minnesota Timberwolves trade for Rudy Gobert. And I don't think Beverley will be the last player to be flipped for other assets from that Rudy Gobert trade, but we'll talk about that later. THT has gone up and down the Lakers hype train over the last 12 to 18 months, but there is no doubt that there was some talent there. He was never going to fit in well as an off-ball player alongside someone like LeBron, but on ball, he can create his own shot, and his combination of speed, size, and strength makes him very adept at getting to and finishing at the rim. Will he ever be the future star some thought he would be over the last 12 to 18 months? Unlikely. Those expectations were probably a bit overblown, but THT can certainly be a nice bench scorer at the very least. Walker Kessler is the other 2022 first-round pick that was added this offseason, and on a team devoid of centers after the trade of Rudy Gobert, he will likely step into a significant role this season with the Jazz. At 7'1" with a 7'4" wingspan, he blocked more shots than all but 13 Division I teams last year in college, and looks to be the next rim-protecting center for the Jazz moving forward. Jared Vanderbilt is one of my favorite role players in the NBA, and is still only 23. He's a great rebounder, a good defender, and that will always hold value in the NBA. Whether that ends up being with Utah or as a member of another team remains to be seen, but either way, he's going to hold value either as a member of the Jazz or with at least returning a first-round pick. Malik Beasley is a good scoring guard, and he isn't very far removed from being a 20-point-per-game scorer in the NBA. He's coming off a down year in Minnesota, but he has shown his value, and whether in Utah or elsewhere, will continue to be a good scoring guard off of the bench. Leandro Bomero is a 2020 first-round pick that could still find a role for himself in the NBA as well, and will likely get more opportunity in Utah to find that role. And Stanley Johnson is the hard-working defensive wing who likely isn't a part of the Jazz's future, but could net some future assets as a trade deadline acquisition for a contender. And this long list of players doesn't include a few young players that were already on the roster before this summer. Those being Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who was acquired at last year's trade deadline. He was my pick last year to win Most Improved Player. Now, obviously, he did not follow through on that and was a bit of a disappointment, but in a new situation, maybe some of the potential he showed early on in New Orleans can come to fruition in Utah. He's shown flashes of being a very good NBA player, and he's still young, so it's a little bit foolish to completely count him out yet. Udoka Azubuike is a long 6'10" big man, one of the biggest height to wingspan differentials in the NBA, and him alongside Walker Kessler are going to be the guys fighting to prove value at the center position in Utah and could become a valuable asset for Utah over the next few seasons. And Jared Butler was a 2021 second-round draft pick of Utah, who again, as many of these young guys will likely get more opportunity in this upcoming season that is now a rebuild. Now, some of these players are still very young and are likely to be on Utah throughout the duration of this rebuild and could become parts of this team when they are competitive. Players such as Walker Kessler and Okona Agbaji could fit this mold. However, the Jazz have a lot of flexibility, and it's not just with their quantity of draft picks, it's also with their quantity of young players and players in general on this roster. Players such as Jared Vanderbilt and Malik Beasley, who are still young, but are very valuable across the NBA. The Jazz could re-sign them if mutual interest is there and keep them around as role players for further down the line in the rebuild. Or they could flip them for picks and other young players before the end of their contracts. Other players the Jazz could do this with is Stanley Johnson, Taylor Horton-Tucker, Lauri Markkanen, and even Collin Sexton if they desire, depending on how they value each individual player and how they want to move forward. The point is, the Jazz have acquired a lot of players that can fit their timeline if they want to keep them around, or they can net them a return of future assets via trade over the next 1 to 3 seasons. But that just scratches the surface of players the Jazz could trade for additional future assets. Yes, the Jazz have moved on from their 2 stars already, as well as having traded away Royce O'Neal to the Brooklyn Nets. But there are still veterans on this team that can net more future assets for Utah's rebuild. Mike Conley certainly is not a big contract, but is still a solid veteran point guard, and unfortunately that contract does overshadow a little bit that he's still okay. He's not bad by any means, and at the right price and at the right time could net at least a couple of second-round picks or an okay young player for the Jazz. Bojan Bogdanovic is still a very good scoring wing, and for any team that wants a bit more spacing and secondary shot creation, Bogdanovic would be a great addition and should net the Jazz at least another first-round pick to add to their selection of draft picks. Jordan Clarkson, although can be labeled as a bit inefficient and can be labeled as the prototypical inefficient and poor defensive scoring guard off of the bench, his shot creation and playmaking could be a great asset to a team, especially to a team that struggles with injuries at the guard position, and should net the Jazz another first-round pick around the trade deadline. And Rudy Gay, although far removed from his best days in Memphis and Toronto, is still a fine veteran wing to have off of the bench and could net the Jazz some future assets. At the end of the day, the Jazz have ensured 2 things. 1, they will be bad enough over the next few seasons to be one of the best teams in the NBA at the tanking game, ensuring they get a few chances at acquiring a future superstar via the draft. And 2, they have plenty of assets, allowing them to have all of the flexibility to either retain players, move them on for picks, or combine their picks and young talent for a star trade later down the road. Finally, the Jazz have picked a direction, and I couldn't be happier about that. They are sure to add some great talent via the draft in the next few seasons, whilst already sitting on a ton of assets. It's going to be some tough years in Utah over the next few seasons, but they have committed to a rebuild. And with Danny Ainge at the helm, he has shown that he can build a team up whilst having some high draft picks. And I have no doubt that with some time, the Jazz again will be competitive in the West.